Hello and welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is securing HTTP triggers with Azure AD. Let's go. So why is this episode important? So by default, the HTTP triggers are secured with a SAS token that is included in the URL. There's essentially a query parameter called sig that includes essentially a key that can be used from authentication. Now, while it is secure, some organizations aren't big fans of this approach because that URL can be copied and used outside of their network. So fair enough, it makes sense. Now, in the past, I've used Azure API Management as a way to introduce another layer of detection or protection, and that is another option, but today we're going to focus on Azure AD. And so we can introduce Azure AD that allows you to enable authentication against the endpoint. Essentially, you need to be able to create an Azure AD token and be able to pass that token when calling the logic app. If that token sort of is invalid or not the right token, you're going to get a security error. So in essence, you're protecting the endpoint from that perspective. Now, since this is part of Azure Active Directory, we can also take advantage of other capabilities such as conditional access. You could even impose network restrictions on when you can go ahead and call this specific endpoint. The other thing is you can't go ahead and disable the SAS key, but you can check for the existence of a bearer token as part of your trigger condition. And we're going to talk about this at the end of the video, and just adding that gives you just another layer of governance as well. But another scenario that also is enabled through this mechanism is once you have that token is you can open that token up and actually inspect it, almost like a claim. And when you do that, you can go ahead and see what are basically the functions that you want to enable this specific client to be able to execute. We're going to talk much more about that in the demo as well. All right, let's get started. So the first thing that we need to do is go ahead and create a consumption logic app. The steps that I'm going to go through on this video are very much related to consumption logic app itself. Now we'll go ahead and we'll create something quite simple. We don't need to sort of build anything complicated at this point. Really just go ahead and add a HTTP trigger to the beginning of your logic app, and then we can go ahead and provide a response. The body response doesn't really matter too much. I would just put something so that you know that it's working correctly when we go ahead and test it inside of Postman. So that's kind of the basic structure that we want to have going forward before we get further into the demo. So we can go ahead and test our logic app to make sure it's working. I'm not going to demo this part, but feel free to go ahead and copy the trigger URL that includes the SAS key, go into Postman, issue a post request, and then make sure that you have a response going back, just so that you know you're starting off with a healthy logic app before we start to make some of the more complicated changes around it. So now this is where it's called the fun starts. So if you're not familiar with Azure AD, obviously that's our authentication mechanism inside of Microsoft's cloud technologies. And what we can do is we can go ahead and create what's known as Azure App Registrations. These are essentially, let's call them entities, or apps you could refer to, that allows us to go ahead and essentially create credentials around it. And we can use these app registrations as a way to impose authentication. So kind of behind the scenes, what will typically happen, even with a lot of products that you use inside of the Microsoft, is that they'll publish their own registrations that allows their technology to work with a company's Azure AD tenant. So for example, if you look for Power Automate and you look for Power Apps, you're going to see that Microsoft provides these applications inside of Azure AD, and that's one of the ways that it helps facilitate you logging into the Power Automate portal, you logging into Power Apps Maker portal, and being able to actually interact with your tenant itself. So we're going to kind of do something like that, which we're naturally going to go ahead and control. Now there's two different Azure app registrations that we need to go ahead and make. I'm just calling them Logic App Client, and then I'm going to call the second one Logic App Service, just so it's very clear what the responsibility of this specific app is going to go ahead and do. Now, if you've never gone ahead and created an app Azure app registration. Here, let me just show you what that looks like. Okay, so if you're in the Azure portal, and there's a high probability that, depending upon your organization, you may or may not have access to do this. You may need to loop in an admin to help you create these registrations, but it all depends on sort of the permission set that you're dealing with. So you go into the Azure portal, you just go ahead and search for Azure Active Directory. Then on the left-hand side, look for app registrations. And here's where you'd have the ability to go ahead and to create a new one. So this was the screenshot that I provided previously. I'm just going to call this sample for now, and then I'll show you how I've created mine, right? But you can just go ahead and create this, and then you can naturally go ahead and configure it. So in my case, I've gone ahead, I've created one called Logic App Client. Now note there are some values here that are going to be needed like throughout the course of this video. So application or client ID, this is something that you're going to need down the road. The tenant ID is another value that you're also going to need when we go ahead and make a call to request the token itself. The other thing that we need to do for the client is we need to go ahead and we have to create a secret. So if we click on certificates and secrets, then we can go ahead and click on new client secret, choose the duration for how long you want the secrets to last, provide a description, and then you're going to have the ability to copy the value. Do make a copy of this as you're creating it. Otherwise, you might be out of luck and then have to go back and just create a new one itself. And so that's essentially kind of what we need to do from a client perspective. Give good descriptions. Nothing worse than trying to come back to the portal down the road and try to figure out where this is being used. So do give valuable descriptions here as well. And yeah, so this is how sort of I ended up. I went ahead and created Logic App Client. I just use single tenant. In this case, there's no need to use multi-tenant. We don't need to provide a redirect URI. We're not hosting a website that's going to do a redirect after authentication. Click register, then go into certificates and secrets. Go ahead, create a new client secret, provide a valid expiration date, and then naturally go ahead and copy the secret. So that's the app number 1, client Azure app. Now we need to go ahead and create app number 2. So once again, same portal, same experience. We want to go ahead and create another app registration. This time we're going to call it Logic App Service. It's going to represent the service side of things, not so much the client. Once again, you can go ahead and create it using single tenant. We don't have a redirect URI. We can go ahead and click register from that perspective. Now, one thing that's going to be a little bit different from us is that we do need to go ahead and create an application ID URI. And so when you're on that overview page, you're going to see this link here that says add an application ID URI. You essentially can click that, accept the defaults. You're going to get essentially something that looks like this. It's going to be prefixed with API : / and then essentially your client ID for your service Azure app registration itself. Once you've gone ahead and done that, then what you're going to need to do is expose an API. And so what you can do is click on expose an API, add a scope, and then what you're going to see is this being prompted if you've already gone ahead and done it. If you haven't done it before, you're going to need to click this set button to make sure you have an application ID URI. At this point, you'd be able to save and continue. And so you can kind of think of it, this is why I'm calling it client versus service. We're going to have a service, and that service is going to expose specific functionality that the client can go ahead and take advantage of. So you want to go ahead and expose a scope through an API itself. Next up, what we need to do, once we've gone ahead and done that, we've exposed the API, is we want to create an app role. And so we'll click on app roles in the left nav. We'll go ahead then click on create app role, and then we can provide just some additional information. This stuff isn't overly pertinent what you select here. Well, I guess this one is. We want to make sure that it's an application calling it. It's not a user or group. This value is arbitrary, so I've just called it call trigger, and then obviously provide a good description, and then enable this app role. And so this is kind of important in the sense that later on I'm going to show you essentially when we crack open the token, what role the token basically relates to. So you can kind of think of this almost like a claim. And so if you had a more complicated scenario where you were exposing multiple different pieces of functionality, you could expose multiple app roles and assign them to specific clients. And that could differentiate, say, their access. Maybe it's the ability to create something versus read something. In our case, it's going to be quite simple. We're just going to call a trigger. And so that's why I'm just giving you this value here. But do pay attention. Later on down the road, we're going to see this being emitted inside the token itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and just take a peek at my service app and just do a little walkthrough there. So if I head over to Azure Active Directory and I go into app registrations, this is where I can find my 2 registrations that I've previously created, right? So I can go ahead here, click on Logic App Service. There's going to be some information we're going to be interested in here as well, right? Like the tenant will be the same as before. Our client ID is going to be different, so this is important. And then I've already created it so we don't see it, but that's that application ID URI. We need to ensure that we set this up. This will be used later on. Now, we did talk about exposing an API before, so I can go ahead and click that and see that I've exposed the API. And then I can go ahead and see that I've exposed the app role itself. And so if I go ahead and click on this, we can see that call trigger that I was mentioning previously from that perspective. And so that's essentially our service app registration. We don't need to go ahead and create a secret for this particular one, so that's not required in this instance. So now that we've gone ahead, we've kind of created the base Azure client app registration, we've created the service app registration. Now what we need to do is provide permission for our client to basically be able to go ahead and call our service API. And so that's what's happening here in this screen. We're going to be in our Logic App client. We're going to click on API permissions. We're going to click on add a permission. And then we're going to be able to go ahead and browse for our Logic App service. And we'll be able to find it. And then here, this is where we can see call trigger. So if we would have created multiple app roles on that previous screen in the service side app, we would be able to choose which of those permissions are going to be granted to our client itself. And so if you've got multiple clients and you want to distinguish, one from the other in terms of what they can go ahead and do, that's how you would go ahead and do that. Now, the other thing, once we've gone ahead and granted permission to that API, notice that we've got a consent warning that we have to deal with here. Now, in this case, we are going to need an admin to go ahead and grant admin consent. Now in this Weare, that's the name of my tenant, so that'll look different for you. But without this being granted, our solution isn't going to work. So this is where you might need an admin to log into the portal, go into the client Azure app registration, go into the API permissions, and then essentially click this link to basically enable this, for use. So let's flip over to the Azure portal and I'll just show you what mine looks like. Okay, so once again, we're in the Logic App client. We're going to click on API permissions. Now, what I've done, this is already configured, but how I found it is I clicked on add a permission, then I'd be able to find APIs. Now, in this case, I clicked on my APIs because I own it, so I'd be able to select it here. Otherwise, you might find it in APIs my organization uses. I went and clicked on this. I found it, I checked it on, I added permissions. Now, I've already added it, so naturally I can't add it again. It would be running under delegated permissions from that perspective. Once again, you can see that it's already been granted consent by the admin, so I don't have to go ahead and do it, but that's where I would go ahead and get that admin to do it if I didn't have access myself. Okay, now we're kind of playing ping pong a little bit, but there's kind of just an order to setting this all up. Now, what we want to do now is we want to update the service manifest file for our Logic App's service app registration, and we can do so by clicking this manifest here and then updating the access token accepted version to 2. Now, this is kind of an optional step, but I think it makes sense to do it. This is the newer version of essentially the schema, and it's going to have an impact on essentially how we validate our claims based upon the token service that is being used to generate the token itself. And so this will make a little more sense when we go ahead and configure it in Logic Apps, but you're going to want to update this to 2. If you don't, you're going to find that the scenario won't work if you follow the rest of the video itself. So this will just create a different audience, and this will go ahead and change the shape of our authentication. And so it's important to go ahead and update to the latest there. And so as I mentioned before, that's going to be in our Logic App service. Click on Manifest, go in and find the access token accepted version, set that to 2, and then hit save. And so this is why that's important itself. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go into our Logic App and we're going to enable Azure AD Authorization. We're going to create a policy around it. And so when we go ahead and click on Authorization, we need to provide the issuer and the audience. And this is a form of validation. So when the token is submitted, the Logic Apps and with the help of Azure AD is going to crack open that token and look to see if the issuer and the audience match the information that you provide in this screen. If you go ahead and don't update that manifest on the service, this value is going to be different. It's going to be like an URL that includes like STS. It's going to use like the old sort of token service, so that URL is going to be different from that perspective. And so that's why this is a pretty important step. On the previous slide was to go ahead and update the manifest. So then you'll be using this issuer as opposed to the older STS issuer itself. Now, when you go ahead and configure these 2 drop-downs, there's a couple things you need to be aware of. The issuer is going to use this URL, and it's going to then include your tenant ID, right? So my tenant ID is going to be different than your tenant ID. That was why I pointed out the tenant ID value in the app registration side of things. You can go ahead and grab the value there. Then here you want to use the endpoint v2.0, and that 2 is very much related to the service manifest that we previously updated, where we switched the value to 2. The other value we need to provide here is the Logic App Service App Client ID. So from the overview page of your service app registration, go ahead and grab your client ID. This is mine. Yours will be different from that perspective. So where do we find those settings? So we need to go to my Logic App. So here I've got my consumption Logic App. I'm just in my overview page. Go down to the bottom, sort of in the middle, I guess, on the left-hand side, click on Authorization. And here's where we're going to be able to go ahead and to create a policy. Just go ahead, add policy, then be able to issue these claims. In this case, we're going to use issuer and audience and provide the values that we want. And then we can go ahead and hit save. Now at this point, your Logic App will be looking for essentially these values to be sent in. And if you're not sending in these values without the SAS key, of course, that this will fail if you haven't set this up correctly from that perspective. So don't try to call your Logic App just yet. We've got a few more steps to do in order to make that work. But at this point, this is the kind of the point in time where you're saying this Logic App is only going to accept requests where Azure AD is included when the SAS token is not provided. And so this might become a little confusing for some people. So there is no way to go ahead and completely remove the SAS token, right? So that is something that will still exist from that perspective. So, but the difference is if you're going to go ahead and make your Logic App callable from another, say, system or process, you would never share the SAS key. So you as an admin would have the ability to go ahead and sort of control that. What you're saying is that if you're dealing with a partner or you're dealing with other dev teams, they wouldn't even know that that SAS key exists. Now, we're also going to show later on towards the end of the demo how you can filter out requests where someone has used the SAS key and haven't done the bearer token. But basically, if someone provides a bearer token when requesting, when calling your Logic App, if it's not valid, they will not be able to call your Logic App. So that's kind of an important distinction from that perspective. Now, another thing that we want to do, now I guess you don't really have to do this, but I think later on, if you want to validate the token yourself or parse the token yourself, you do need to do this. In the Logic App code view, we need to go ahead and add an attribute to our trigger called operation options, and then we've got a value of include authorization header in outputs. So by design, Logic Apps currently doesn't emit any tokens that are provided, because it could be perceived as sort of a security, not a threat, but just could be abused in some ways, right? If people were looking through the logs, they could go ahead and snatch that information. Naturally, there's other ways to restrict that by IP address as well, so I wouldn't be overly concerned with it, but just be aware of it. So this property is talked more about in the following link. I'll include that in the description of the video if you want to learn more about that. Now, in terms of how do we go ahead and enable that, go up to your Logic App code view. You won't be able to do this through the designer. And then, depending upon the size of your Logic App, scroll to the bottom and then go ahead and add it right here. So it's basically going to be inside of your trigger, right? So find kind equals HTTP, then add it here. Operation options include authorization header in outputs to enable that. And we'll see why this is important a little bit later. Okay, so now we're at the point where we can go ahead and test our Logic App. And so this is going to be a two-step process. Number one, we have to go ahead and generate a token, a valid token. Like this is sort of part of the process of enabling Azure AD authorization to a Logic App is now you need to provide a valid token. And so we're going to go ahead and generate a token first, and then we're going to use that token to then go ahead and call our Logic App. Okay, so this is step number one. Cool. So step number one is we're going to want to go ahead and make a call, a get, to this specific URL, right? So login.microsoftonline.com/ then your tenant ID. This is a variable, so don't get hung up on the curly braces. Don't include that. You're going to include just your tenant ID, which is going to be a GUID. Then /OAuth2/token. So that's what you're going to call. You're going to use basically the form URL encoded body type, and then we need to provide these specific values. So we've got grant _ type, client _ ID, client _ secret, resource. This is hard coded, so you can just put the grant type is going to be client _ credentials. Now, in terms of the client ID, so this is going to be from your client app registration, your client ID, which will just be a GUID. And in this case, like, your value will be different than mine. The next is that client secret, so I won't hover over that. That'll be that secret that we created in our app registration for the client itself, right? So that was the value that you copied and hopefully put into your notepad from that perspective. Resource, this is going to be the application ID from our service app. So this is going to be that value of API : / your client ID. So when you had to go ahead and create that value from the overview page in the service app registration, this is where we need it. And so what we're going to do is we can go ahead and click this button and generate this token. And this token has a time to live, so this token will be long expired by the time this video comes out. So I'm just showing it here, but just be aware of it. But this is what we want to go ahead and copy. And we can go ahead and copy that value. And with this value, this is what we're going to send as part of our requests. So if we flip over to Postman, now what we can go ahead and do is call our Logic App. And notice here, like, this is a variable again, but this is essentially the URL for my Logic App, but without that signature, without the SAS signature. So essentially, if I tried to call this with a bad, basically bearer token, this is going to fail, and I'll show you that after. But what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and basically paste in our token. We're going to do a post. In this case, I don't have any parameters. There's nothing really special about the headers, just saying application JSON. And I can go ahead and call this, and we're going to see that it returns hello world. Now, if I have an old token or an invalid token, so let's just, replace a few values here. I can go send this. This is going to fail, right? And so this is kind of the whole point. If you don't have a valid token, you can't go ahead and call that Logic App when you don't have the SAS token itself. And so that is what's going on here that proves what's going on from that perspective. Now, one thing I did want to call out when we think about tokens, and this is an old token, this is like from a week ago, so don't be too interested in it. When we do pass in a valid token, this is what's going to happen with Azure Active Directory. It's going to be able to go ahead and unpack it and then verify it. And so that's where we see like the audience and the issuer, like these are values that we had previously configured as part of our authorization policy. And so this is what gets essentially translated from, a token that looks like this, broken down into more readable attributes itself. And also note that we can see that role, which we had previously had provided to our client. And so we could further unpack this inside of Azure Logic Apps in order to go ahead and discover that. So this next section in the video, I'm not going to go through this in a tremendous amount of detail because Jan has done a great job of already doing that. He will show you how you can go ahead and break apart that token using just Logic App expressions and compose actions in order to be able to see this additional information. So go ahead, check out his blog post. I'll include a link in the description of this video. And once again, so I'm not going to go through this in a tremendous amount of details because he's done a great job already, but just to give you a sense of what he's doing here is we've got a series of expressions here. We're going to go ahead and grab the headers. Here we're just going to go ahead and split out the headers. Essentially, we want to get rid of the word bearer. We want to get just access to the direct token itself. Here there's just some conditional logic about, he's basically validating the length of the token to determine to see if it needs to be padded or not. Once again, go to his blog post. He's got all of the expressions. You can just copy and paste. The end result is we're going to get access to that token, which similar to what we just saw on that other web page. So if we go ahead and we look at the run history of a specific instance, we're going to be able to go ahead and see all of these values, right? So here we've got the authorization header. Now, this is why it was important to go ahead into the code view and enable being able to read those authorization headers in our outputs. Here we're going to go out, get just the token itself. Here we can see that it's got a modello of 3, which will have an impact on how we go ahead and pad our token. And then when we go ahead and convert it from base 64 to JSON, we can see information similar to what we saw in that website before. Once again, these tokens have long expired, so I'm not overly concerned about it from that perspective. And so this is what we could do to further validate someone's role. And if we wanted to sort of break off or branch off using different logic, we could. Now, lastly, what I did want to also show as well is that what happens when someone goes ahead and uses a SAS token, right? If they use a SAS token, they could still go ahead and call this Logic App, right? Well, there's something that we can do to prevent that. On this channel, I've talked about trigger conditions before, and we can use a trigger condition in this case, right? So on our trigger, we can add a trigger condition to ensure that our authorization header starts with bearer. Now, if you're using a SAS token, you're not going to have a bearer token, right? So this will basically get flagged. This will not meet our criteria. The other thing is that, as we saw before, if we pass in a bad authorization header, it will get sort of blocked up front. Like our policy is going to block it. So what you can assume at this point is that if your Logic App has reached this point and you have an authorization header, that it's going to be valid because it would have been kicked back already. And if someone has used a SAS token instead, they're not going to have this value. And as a result, this is going to error. So we can go ahead and take a look at what that result is inside of Postman. And so here I've got a Logic App with a SAS token. And if I go ahead and try to call this Logic App, we essentially get a failure. Now, I guess in theory, you could move this step below the trigger so that you could return sort of a different code from an HTTP response and, issue some sort of like authentication issue, 401 access denied, something to that effect. Up to you. You have some control from that perspective. All right, well, that concludes this video. I know there was a lot to unpack there, but it's a pretty important topic. The other thing that I talk about that we didn't get to is that when using Azure AD, that also allows us to use conditional access policies as well. So that might be another sort of level of governance you can impose here if you wanted to restrict what say networks or IP addresses that these requests are being made from. So that's interesting. Also, naturally, we've got Azure API Management that provides additional governance capabilities when integrated with Logic apps as well. So thanks for watching this video. All of my details are there if you want to follow me, and we'll catch you next time. Take care.